Yes!
Destiny 1 has some incredible weapons belonging to the exotic and legendary rarities, and a handful of them have found their way into Destiny 2. Some of the most powerful and iconic exotic weapons, such as Thorn, the Last Word, and Source Regime, are obtainable in Destiny 2 and are just as good, if not better, than their D1 versions. But back in Destiny 1, there was an exotic weapon that was just as powerful as it was unique, known as the Zhalo Supercell. And in this weapon, we're going to familiarize ourselves with this weapon and discuss if it should return in Destiny 2 or not. So without further ado, let's get it in. Zhalo Supercell was an exotic auto rifle belonging to what's known in Destiny 2 as the 600 RPM archetype, which is the same RPM class that Monte Carlo and Hardlight belong to. Zhalo was one of the exotic weapons that made its debut in the Taken King DLC, which kicked off year 2 of Destiny 1, and it didn't take long for it to be distinguished from the other exotic weapons. You see, back in Destiny 1, weapons were classified as primary, special, and heavy. Sounds the same as Destiny 2, right? Well, there's a few discernible differences with Destiny 1's weapon system. In Destiny 1, hand cannons, scout rifles, auto rifles, and pulse rifles all belong to the primary slot. Fusion rifles, shotguns, sidearms, and sniper rifles all belong to the special slot, and machine guns, rocket launchers, and swords were all in the heavy slot. But in Destiny 2, the weapon system consists of kinetic energy and heavy weapons, meaning that weapons that take primary ammo or special ammo can exist in the kinetic or the energy slot, whereas they will be confined to one or the other in Destiny 1. And outside of the No Land Beyond and Universal Remote, there were no kinetic shotguns and sniper rifles in Destiny 1, whereas we have a bunch of these in Destiny 2. And back in year 1 of Destiny 1, we had access to a handful of primary weapons that dealt elemental damage. The Vortiglass Ray exotic Vexmitha class fusion rifle being one of many. Now, if you're a Destiny 2 player who never played D1, you're probably confused trying to make sense of all this, so I'll go ahead and explain. Like I said before, all weapons classified as primary belong to the primary slot, which means that this slot was home to primaries that dealt kinetic damage and elemental damage. Of course, this became an issue because kinetic damage primary weapons in D1 year 1 were vastly underutilized in the PvE endgame compared to that of their elemental damage brethren. And the obvious reasoning was because elemental damage weapons did a significantly better job dealing with elemental shields like they were designed to. Now, it didn't take long at all for Bungie to catch wind of this, and the moment that the Taken King DLC launched, those of us who played back then were astonished by the realization that there were no new elemental damage primaries in the game aside from one weapon, that weapon being the Zhalo Supercell. As stated previously, Zhalo was a 600 RPM exotic auto rifle, and it was the only primary weapon released in year 2 of Destiny 1 that had an elemental burn in the form of art damage. This weapon was a PvE powerhouse because it made short work of red bar trash mobs via its namesake intrinsic perk, which granted it a chance for its projectiles to chain from one enemy to another. The description of this perk states that it grants a chance, but I recall this perk proccing very frequently, and it was to the point where I could rely on it all the time. Because when you see the word chance, the first thing that comes to mind is RNG, randomness, or anything of the sort, but if I recall correctly, this perk had a very high proc rate, and when it kicked in, it put in some serious work. Its other perk, Bolts from the Blue, would grant super energy from double kills and return ammo to his magazine. You probably wouldn't even need to see gameplay evidence of how crazy this weapon was, because simply describing its capabilities would give you the realization that this thing was an clear expert. But just by seeing this weapon in action, and or if you've never played Destiny 1, you're probably thinking to yourself like, yo, this weapon is very familiar to the Riskrunner, and you wouldn't be wrong to make that comparison, because you would be crazy to deny the obvious signs that the Riskrunner is a literal spiritual successor to the Zhalo Supercell. Both of these weapons are art damage exotic primaries with high fire rates and specialize in clearing ads. And if you're familiar with the similarities shared between Zhalo Supercell and Riskrunner, you were fully aware that it was a matter of time before I compared them. So now that we've approached the elephant in the room, we can discuss if Zhalo Supercell would be a good addition in Destiny 2, but realistically speaking, that can only be done by further comparing it to Riskrunner. So first off, it's safe to say that if submachine guns existed in Destiny 1, that's more than likely the weapon class that Zhalo would have belonged to. I mean, look at this thing. It's compact and it looks like a bullpup mini AK-47, which is another one of this weapon's oddities because as far as I'm concerned, auto rifles have always been the only primary weapons in the Destiny universe that don't have bullpup designs. So I believe that Bungie was going for a submachine gun-esque weapon, but couldn't classify it as such since, once again, SMGs didn't exist in Destiny 1. One of the major differences between Zhalo and Riskrunner is the fact that Riskrunner requires its wielder to become afflicted by art damage in order for it to actually do anything. And until Riskrunner's wielder is taking art damage, it's literally a regular 900 RPM submachine gun. But art damage from any source that damages you while wielding Riskrunner causes this weapon to go from Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde in the blink of an eye, because once that happens, the Art Conductor perk works as magic. Art Conductor states that when taking art damage, this weapon becomes more powerful and resists incoming art damage. Kills extend the time in this overcharged state. Okay, so basically, anybody under the effects of Arc Conductor will be covered by an aura that reduces the potency of all incoming arc damage, and a 5-second Arc Conductor timer will appear on the left side of the screen. All you gotta do is kill an enemy with Riskrunner, and this timer will reset back to 5, and will continue doing so provided that you have acid kill. Riskrunner's second perk, Superconductor, works in tandem with Arc Conductor, and states that when Arc Conductor is active, shots fired have the chance to become chain lightning and return ammo. Now once again, none of this is possible until you take arc damage, but the cool thing about it is that it can be arc damage from any source. Vex Radiolarian fluid and the explosion of your own arc grenades will proc Arc Conductor, so the necessity of being afflicted by arc damage isn't really that much of a handicap when you really think about it. Another thing I noticed is that Riskrunner's Superconductor perk borrows attributes from both of Zhalo's signature perks. Superconductor states that when Arc Conductor is active, shots fired have the chance to become chain lightning and return ammo. The chain lightning aspect of Superconductor is borrowed from Zhalo's intrinsic perk, whereas the returning ammo to the magazine aspect of Superconductor is borrowed from Zhalo's boast from the blue perk. Okay, so no matter which side of the fence you're on in regards to Zhalo Supercell having a place in Destiny 2, you gotta admit that it shares a ton of similarities with Riskrunner, and both weapons fulfill the same exact role. So with that being stated, I personally believe that this weapon should stay in Destiny 1. Don't get me wrong by any means, I love Zhalo Supercell and I enjoy using it in Destiny 1, but bringing it into Destiny 2 will be completely redundant. I mean, we already have an arc damage bullet holes exotic weapon in Destiny 2, and we confirmed that Riskrunner is shockingly, no pun intended, similar to Zhalo Supercell to the point where it's almost the same exact weapon, of course with a few minor differences. Simply put, Riskrunner was meant to be a successor to Zhalo, and that's not a secret. And if you watch my previous videos discussing if a Destiny 1 weapon should return to Destiny 2, my argument is always prefaced with why. Why bring back an old weapon when Bungie could invest that same amount of time into making a brand new weapon? Why bring back an old weapon when we already have something that's just as good if not better? Yeah, I understand if you have a lot of fond memories about a particular weapon and you would like to experience them again, but Zhalo Supercell made its debut in an era where it was one of a kind, since it was the only elemental damage primary introduced in the Taken King DLC. And during that time in Destiny 1, we didn't have a choice but to use kinetic damage weapons for in-game PvE. But in Destiny 2, none of this is applicable because, as stated previously, Bungie figured out a way for kinetic damage primaries and elemental damage primaries to coexist in Destiny 2 without any real loadout restrictions. Now, if you played Destiny 1 in Year 3 during the Age of Triumph, all 4 of the raids were updated and could drop exotic versions of their respective primary weapons, and the exotic rarity raid primary weapons were known as adept weapons. These adept weapons weren't quote-unquote true exotic weapons because their exotic rarity was only defined by the fact that they had elemental burns, and aside from that, they were literally the same as their legendary kinetic counterparts. For example, the Adept Genesis Chain from the Wrath of Machine raid and the Adept Abyss Defiant from the Crotus End raid dealt solar damage, whereas their legendary versions dealt kinetic damage. Again, this was in Year 3 because the Year 1 versions of these legendary raid weapons all had elemental burns, but when the Taken King DLC released, all Year 1 weapons and armor were left behind and didn't have the ability to be infused. Given all of these raid weapons, the exotic rarity was Bungie's way of making them a meaningful choice because, in Bungie's eyes, if we were going to have the ability to use elemental damage primaries, there had to be some sort of realistic restriction. And that same sense of restriction wasn't present in Year 1 of Destiny 1 when it came to the elemental damage legendary primary weapons. I apologize if it seems that I divagated away from my original point, but I figured that mentioning the intricacy that elemental damage primary weapons cause and Destiny 1 was perfectly relevant. And when Destiny 1 OGs are asked if their favorite weapon or armor piece should return to Destiny 2, nostalgia is always the biggest contributing factor to how they feel over realism, in a sense that people simply want the weapon to return because of how heavily affined to it they were, despite how nonsensical it would be. So yeah, I don't think the Zhalo Supercell should return, in Destiny 2 at least. Maybe in a future Destiny iteration, but for the 1 millionth time, it shares too many similarities with Riskrunner and wouldn't have the unique status as the only elemental damage primary weapon like it did in the Taken King era. Well, everybody, that does it for this one. I hope that you enjoyed this video. In the comment section, tell me if you prefer Zhalo Supercell or Riskrunner. If you made it to the end of this video, do me a favor and thumb rush that like button until it turns blue. And if you're new to my neck of the woods, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon so you don't ever miss a video of the most elite gaming content. But with that being stated, 1LHD is over and out. Y'all take it easy.